Hello Year 4. Today in English we're going to be identifying the features of narrative poems. To start with, I've got you a sentence here. What I would like you to do, using the different grammatical features that I've given you in the bottom left hand corner here, I would like you to write this sentence down on a piece of paper and identify the grammatical features in this sentence. So you'll have to be labelling what grammatical feature each word is. Pause the video please and off you go. Okay, let's take the first word, for example, to start with. The. Does anyone know what type of word the is? Well done. It's a determiner. It comes before the noun. So now I've given you a bit of a clue. What type of word is swan, Year 4? Can you tell the screen? Absolutely. It's a noun. It's a thing. It's an animal. Great job. Next one then, glided. The swan glided. Now for those of you who've not heard of this word before, glided is where you are moving in a certain way. So if I told you it's a way of moving, what do you think? What type of word is glided? Absolutely, it's a verb. A verb is a doing word, an action. Great job. So now we know that the swan glided peacefully. Now, peacefully, what do we know about that ly on the end? What clue does that give us? It's an adverb. It tells us how the noun is performing the verb, how the swan is gliding peacefully, how it's being done. Great job. Okay, this word across. What type of word is the word across? Absolutely, it's a preposition. It tells you where it is. And we have another type of word, the. What type of word is this, the? It's a determiner. Great job. Now here, the glistening water. Glistening. Glistening. We've seen that word from yesterday, so we should know what type of word that is. Great job. It's an adjective. And finally then, water. What type of word is water? It's a noun. Fantastic. If you would like to stretch your brain, did anyone notice here, the glistening water? It's a type of phrase. What type of phrase is it? Do you remember? Well done. It's a noun phrase because we have our noun, water, and we are describing what it looks like, glistening. If I had two adjectives, so the glistening, blue, water, for example, what type of phrase would that be then? Expanded noun phrase. Well done, good remembering. What do our two adjectives need to be separated by Year 4 if we have an expanded noun phrase? A comma. Well done. So that was our starter for today, and hopefully your brains are all warmed up. Today we are going to continue with our narrative poetry unit. We know that the word narrative means story. So we now know that a narrative poem is a poem that tells a story. We also know that there are some similarities and some differences between stories and poems. Both narrative poems and stories both tell a story, and they both have settings and characters. The thing about narrative poems and just normal stories is that they both might be long, but we know stories are often novels or books, so they are quite a bit longer than narrative poems. However, the differences between narrative poems and stories have chapters, paragraphs, but poems have verses. Do you remember that other word? Not a verse, but to describe a little 4 lines in a poem. Well done, it's a stanza, and that separates the different verses too. Poems also have rhyme, and they need to think about syllables. Now, we're going to be having a look about the features of narrative poetry today, so don't worry too much if you're feeling a bit confused so far. There are several features of narrative poems, but let's look at the narrative side of it first. Things that we know are similar between the narrative poems and stories. In a narrative poem, we always look for an introduction, and that will look like a few lines or a verse, maybe even a stanza, and it will normally set the scene a little bit, but not too much like in a story. Just a few lines will do. A narrative poem uses characters, like in a story too, and it also has a plot. and a plot is a storyline, so it's like a story. A narrative poem also has chronological series of events. Do you know what the word chronological means? Absolutely, events that happened in order. If we are writing a non-chronological series of events, like when we write our non-chronological reports, they're not in order. But narrative poems are chronological. So they say, this happened, then that happened, then this happened. And they sometimes, not always, use time sequencing words like then, next, afterwards, finally, etc. Some of them also have rhyme. We're going to look a bit about what rhyme looks like today, and also rhythm, which we'll look at too. Narrative poems have the intention to be read aloud, like I read to you yesterday, or the day before even. They also have lots of informal language and punctuation to help the reader read in a type of way. And that's like what we were doing the other day when we were focusing on intonation and volume. And that informal language and punctuation helps the reader to read it in a better way to the audience. And finally, narrative poems sometimes have dialogue. So do you know what these are called down here? That's right, they're called inverted commas. Well done. Now it's really important to note that sometimes in a narrative poem, and you'll find today, that yes, they do have dialogue, they do have people speaking, but they don't always show it with inverted commas. Sometimes they just said, he said, or she said, so we need to look out for that too. We have briefly spoke about stanzas, and here's something in a bit more detail. So we know that stanzas are a group of lines that are gathered together, a bit like a paragraph, but we don't call them that in poetry. It's really important to note that if the stanza has 4 or more lines, it can often be called a verse. Okay? So if we have a look at our examples of stanzas here, we've got a first stanza and a second stanza. Okay? Rhyme is a bit different, okay? Rhyme occurs when 2 words sound the same when they're spoken out loud, like fright and night, would and hood, should and could. They don't always need to be spelt the same, they just sound the same. And rhyme is used in poetry to create something interesting to read. It creates a pattern, so when you're reading it, it sounds a bit nicer to read, and you'll notice that today. Now, we often talk about the fact that there is rhythm in narrative poetry too, and this can be created by syllables. Do you know what a syllable is? Well done. Syllables is a unit of written or spoken words. So for example, cat has 1 syllable. Fluffy has 2 syllables. Catches mice has 3 syllables. Now, do you know how many syllables your name has? Can you count on your finger and count how many syllables your name has? Shall I show you mine first? Miss Newman. 3. How many does yours have? You might need to pause the video to have a think. Well done. So that's what a syllable is. Syllables are used in poetry to create rhythm. It makes it sound nicer when you're reading it. So, we are familiar with this poem, The Willow Pattern by Tony Mitten. What I would like you to do, if you have forgotten any of the features, you can just flick back through the video and find them again. But if you think they're fresh in your mind and you remember them, what I would like to do is pause the video and see if you can spot any of the features that we've just looked at that are part of narrative poems in this poem here. Can you pause the video and have a think, please? Off you go. Brilliant. I bet you had lots of fantastic ideas. Now I've had a go myself at annotating this poem and spotting lots and lots of features. Now let's see what I've come up with and see if you've got something similar. So I'm going to talk you through what I've annotated, and what I did is I used the features of the poem which we'd looked at earlier, and I've used that to help me annotate this. So first of all, I started with the introduction, and I found that this is presented in the form of a stanza. And this really sets the scene about what the story is going to be about. A blue garden, it happened in China a long time ago. This bit here is, I've spotted that there are characters, and these are highlighted in green. The soldiers, the emperor's daughter, the emperor, and the man. And I've briefly said here that it makes it sound more like a story. In blue here, I've also identified verbs. Now, we haven't actually looked at verbs being a feature of narrative poems, but they can be. And I really like the fact that this poet has used verbs, because it hasn't just said to catch the princess. He's actually said to capture, which sounds a bit better to me. He's also said that he ordered his soldiers. So it sounds a bit more powerful, and it gives me a bigger picture of what the emperor is actually quite like. The emperor could have told his soldiers, which is still a verb, told, and it sounds a bit nicer, but because he ordered, it sounds a bit stricter. So that's what I've noticed. I started also to count the syllables of each line. She left with the young man. That line has 6 syllables, and I did the rest with the others too. And what I noticed, which is what you might want to notice when you come to annotate yours, is that sometimes the poet used patterns of syllables, and this creates a rhythm further. I've got, around the whole poem, it has a plot and chronological series of events just here, but it doesn't use time sequencing. Not all of them do. It also has a regular rhythm, which we've already said, but I definitely liked this stanza here. And finally, I've also noticed that the 7th stanza, so I've counted them to make it a bit more unique and actually identifying it further, is very similar to the first, because it sounds the same. And to me, I've inferred that it ties the poem together, because it both states it happened in China a long time ago. Now, today, I would like you to annotate your own narrative poem. The narrative poem that I would like you to annotate is this one here, How the Tortoise Got His Shell. Now, I would like you to pause the video and have a read of this poem. Can you do that now for me, please? Fantastic. So hopefully you'd have read the poem by now, and hopefully you'd have understood about it, okay? So How the Tortoise Got His Shell is a brief story about how Zeus, the great god, had a wedding. Now, everyone attended it, the flyers, the creepers, the crawlers, the leapers, apart from the tortoise. And when Zeus asked the tortoise, why weren't you there the day that I was wed, which means the day that I got married, the tortoise said, I'm happy by myself. There's no place quite like home. Can you see here where it says, I'm happy by myself, she said. We've got that reported clause here, she said. Now, we don't have our inverted commas, but that is still dialogue, but we just don't have the inverted commas. But we know in a story that they'd have them there too, don't we? And that's an example of that too. So I've given you a bit of a clue there. So I want you to think of, just really, really quickly, the types of nouns that this writer, this poet, has added into this poem. The flyers and the creepers. Yeah, I want you to take a minute. What type of animals do you think flyers are? I agree. Creatures or animals or insects that fly. Why don't you think that he'd actually said the ladybirds or the bluebirds, for example? That's interesting. So he's carefully chosen specific nouns to actually get a picture across to the reader a bit better. Again here, they raved, they pranced, they feasted, danced. All of these verbs, these doing words, make it a bit more interesting rather than just saying they danced and that be that. They've said lots and lots there and it makes it a bit more interesting. So now hopefully you have a bit of an idea of what the poem is about. What you can do, and I'll flick back to it now, is annotate that poem just like I have with this one, okay? I'm going to leave you with a bit of a plenary to think about. And I want you to think about these 3 questions which link to the poem that you've just read, How the Tortoise Got His Shell. Number 1, what was the tortoise's excuse to Zeus as to why she wasn't there? Number 2, what was her punishment? And number 3, if the poem continues, what might the tortoise say to Zeus to persuade him not to make her wear a shell? So your task, you are going to be annotating this poem. It's in your resources section. You will also be given another copy of the features of a narrative poem, so don't worry if you forgot. But I would like you to annotate it. Use some highlighters or some pens if you don't have any. Make it really, really clear what you're annotating. Try and explain why you think the poet has used these features too. And also make sure you do your plenary and you can write your thoughts down too. I look forward to seeing them. Have a great day.